The dust never settled in Copper Creek, Arizona Territory, 1885. It hung in the air like grief itself, coating everything with a fine layer of amber regret. Marcus Rivera knew this dust well. It had become part of his daily ritual, just like the walk from the Territorial Bank, where he kept the town's books, to Martha's Diner on Main Street. Every evening at precisely 6 o'clock, Marcus would push through the wooden door of the modest eatery, the brass bell announcing his arrival with the same melancholy chime. The diner was nothing fancy. Checkered tablecloths worn thin by desert wind, mismatched chairs, and the perpetual smell of coffee grounds and beef stew. But it was consistent, and consistency was all Marcus had left to cling to. "Evening, Marcus," Martha would call from behind the counter, her weathered hands already reaching for the blue ceramic plate that had become his. At 55, Martha Henderson had seen enough loneliness walk through her door to recognize it in the way a man held his shoulders, the careful distance he kept from other patrons, the methodical way he ate his meals. Marcus would nod, never more than that, and take his seat at the corner table by the window. Table number 7. Always table 7. From there, he could watch the sun die behind the distant mesas, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him too much of the dress Sarah had worn on their wedding day 2 years ago. The beef stew was always the same, thick, with carrots cut into perfect cubes and potatoes that dissolved on his fork. Martha made it the way his late wife Sarah used to, hearty enough to fill the hollow spaces, familiar enough to hurt just right. He'd eat slowly, mechanically, each spoonful a meditation on the art of existing without truly living. The other patrons gave him space. They understood, in the way that frontier people understood hardship, that grief needed room to breathe. The traveling merchants, the ranch hands, the occasional family passing through, they all seemed to instinctively avoid the corner table where the thin man in the pressed white shirt counted his sorrows with each careful bite. Tonight felt different, though Marcus couldn't say why. The autumn air carried a crispness that made the oil lamps flicker more urgently, casting dancing shadows across the worn wooden floor. He'd just taken his first spoonful when the bell chimed again. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, with long black hair that caught the lamplight like silk. Maybe 19, 20 at most. She wore a simple brown dress, with a cream-colored shawl draped over her shoulders, and she carried a worn leather satchel that looked like it had traveled many miles. Her eyes were the color of desert sage, large and observant, taking in every detail of the diner with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read rooms before entering them. What struck Marcus most was her silence. She didn't greet Martha, didn't ask about available tables. She simply stood in the doorway for a moment, those sage-green eyes settling on him with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. Then, without a word, she walked directly to table number 8, the one directly across from his. "Evening, miss," Martha called out, wiping her hands on her apron. "What can I get you tonight?" The girl looked up at Martha and smiled, a small, polite curve of lips that somehow managed to convey both gratitude and apology. She pointed to the chalkboard menu on the wall, then held up one finger, the beef stew. Then she folded her hands in her lap and waited. Marcus found himself stealing glances across the narrow space between their tables. She sat with perfect posture, her hands folded, her attention focused on the window where the last light of day was fading into the indigo embrace of evening. She didn't fidget, didn't look around nervously, didn't seem uncomfortable with the silence that settled around her like morning mist. When Martha brought her bowl, the girl nodded her thanks, but didn't speak. She ate with the same careful deliberation that Marcus recognized in himself, each spoonful measured, each bite a conscious act rather than mere sustenance. But where his eating felt like penance, hers seemed almost meditative, as if she were savoring not just the food, but the moment itself. 20 minutes passed. Marcus finished his stew and reached for his coffee, a cup of bitter black liquid that Martha always brought without being asked. Across from him, the girl had barely made it through half her bowl, but she wasn't dawdling. She was simply present in a way that Marcus had forgotten how to be. He wanted to say something, ask her name, where she was from, why she'd chosen to sit so close when the diner was three-quarters empty, but the words felt rusty in his throat, unused tools left too long in the rain. Besides, there was something about her silence that felt intentional, protective, like a bird that would take flight at the first wrong sound. So instead, Marcus did what he did best. He observed. He noticed the way she held her spoon, the delicate way she blotted her lips with the napkin, the fact that she wore no wedding ring but kept touching a small silver locket that hung just below her collarbone. He noticed that her boots were worn but well cared for, that her dress had been mended more than once, with tiny, perfect stitches, that she carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to make her own way in the world. When she finished eating, she reached into her satchel and pulled out a small leather-bound book and a pencil, worn down to a stub. She opened to a blank page and began to draw, her hand moving in quick, confident strokes. Marcus couldn't see what she was sketching from his angle, but he could see the concentration on her face, the way her tongue darted out slightly when she focused on a particularly difficult detail. The clock on the wall chimed 7:30. Marcus usually left at 7:15, another part of his carefully maintained routine. But tonight he found himself lingering, nursing his coffee and pretending to study the grain of the wooden table while sneaking glances at the mysterious girl across from him. Finally, she closed her book and tucked the pencil back into her satchel. She left exact change on the table. Martha had written the price on a small slip of paper and stood to leave. As she passed Marcus's table, she paused for just a moment. Not long enough to be awkward, but long enough for him to catch the faint scent of lavender soap and something else. Charcoal, maybe, or graphite from her drawing. She looked at him directly for the first time, those sage-green eyes meeting his brown ones with a frankness that was both startling and oddly comforting. Then she smiled, the same small, polite curve of lips she'd given Martha, and continued toward the door. The bell chimed her departure, and Marcus was alone again, with his coffee and the weight of 2 years' worth of carefully constructed solitude. But something had shifted in the familiar landscape of his grief. A small crack had appeared in the wall he'd built around himself, and through it came the faintest whisper of something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. Curiosity. Martha appeared at his elbow with the coffee pot. "Unusual girl," she said, topping off his cup without being asked. "Reminds me of my sister's daughter back in Kansas. She was born that way, could talk just fine, but chose her words like they were silver dollars." Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. He left his usual payment on the table and walked out into the cool desert night, the stars already beginning to pierce the darkening sky like pinpricks in black velvet. But for the first time in 2 years, he didn't hurry home to his empty house. Instead, he stood on the wooden sidewalk for a moment, breathing in the night air and wondering if she would come back tomorrow. Wondering if he wanted her to. The next evening, Marcus arrived at Martha's diner at 5 minutes to 6, earlier than usual, though he told himself it was merely coincidence. The familiar brass bell announced his entrance, and Martha looked up from wiping down the counter with raised eyebrows. "You're early tonight," she observed, her voice carrying the gentle teasing of someone who had known him long enough to notice such things. Marcus hung his hat on the peg by the door and smoothed down his hair, a nervous gesture he hadn't made in years. "Finished the quarterly reports ahead of schedule," he said, which was true enough. He'd worked through lunch to make sure he could leave the bank precisely at closing time. Table 7 was waiting for him, but as he approached it, his eyes automatically drifted to Table 8. Empty, the chair tucked neatly under the checkered tablecloth, no sign that anyone had sat there the night before. Marcus felt a strange disappointment settle in his chest, heavier than he cared to examine. Martha brought his usual beef stew without being asked, along with a thick slice of cornbread that was still warm from the oven. "Looking for someone?" she asked, with the subtle smile of a woman who had raised 3 daughters and could read a man's face like scripture. "No," Marcus replied too quickly, then cleared his throat. "Just noticing how quiet it is tonight." It was quiet. The usual evening crowd hadn't yet arrived, just old Pete nursing his whiskey in the far corner and a young cowboy at the counter who looked like he'd been riding hard all day. The silence felt different without her presence to fill it, less comfortable somehow. Marcus had just taken his 3rd spoonful when the bell chimed. He looked up, trying to appear casual, and felt his shoulders relax when he saw her standing in the doorway. She wore the same brown dress, but tonight she'd braided her long black hair over one shoulder, and the silver locket caught the lamplight as she breathed. Just like the night before, she surveyed the room with those careful, sage-green eyes, then walked directly to table 8. She sat down with the same quiet grace, folded her hands in her lap, and waited for Martha to notice her. "Back again, I see," Martha said warmly, approaching with her order pad even though they both knew she wouldn't need it. "Same as yesterday?" The girl nodded and offered that small, polite smile. Martha jotted something down and headed back to the kitchen, leaving Marcus and the mysterious girl alone in their corner of the diner. Tonight, Marcus felt braver. Maybe it was the way the lamplight softened the sharp edges of his usual anxiety, or maybe it was simply the novelty of having his routine disrupted by something other than grief. When Martha brought the girl's bowl of stew, Marcus cleared his throat softly. "It's good," he said, gesturing toward her meal with his spoon. "Martha's been making it the same way for 15 years. The girl looked up from her stew, those expressive eyes focusing on his face with the same careful attention she'd given the room when she first entered. She nodded once, a gesture that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and gratitude for the information. Then she picked up her spoon and took a careful bite, as if testing his words against the evidence of her own experience. Marcus waited for her to respond verbally, but she simply returned her attention to her meal. Not rudely. There was nothing dismissive about her silence. It felt more like she was choosing her words carefully, weighing them like gold dust before deciding whether to spend them. He tried again. "I don't think I've seen you around Copper Creek before, just passing through." This time she looked up and tilted her head slightly, considering the question. Then she reached into her leather satchel and withdrew the small book he'd seen the night before. She flipped to a page near the front and turned it toward him. Marcus leaned forward slightly to read the neat, careful handwriting. "Luna Santos, artist, from Santa Fe." "Luna," he repeated, and the name felt right on his tongue, like it had been waiting there for her to claim it. "That's a beautiful name." She smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her, not just the polite curve of lips, but something that reached her eyes and lit them from within. She pointed to herself, then to him, raising her eyebrows in a question. "Marcus," he said. "Marcus Rivera. I keep the books at the Territorial Bank." He paused, then added, "I eat here every night." Luna's smile widened slightly, and she made a small gesture with her hand that seemed to say, "I noticed." Then she returned to her book, flipping to a fresh page. Marcus watched as she began to sketch, her pencil moving in quick, confident strokes across the paper. They ate in comfortable silence after that, but it was different from the solitary quiet Marcus had grown accustomed to. This silence had texture, weight, meaning. It was the silence of 2 people sharing space rather than one person occupying it alone. Occasionally, Luna would glance up from her drawing to observe him, her artist's eye cataloguing details he didn't even know he possessed. The way he held his coffee cup, the careful way he tore his cornbread into equal pieces. the unconscious gesture of touching his wedding ring that he still wore on a chain around his neck, hidden beneath his shirt. When she finished eating, Luna closed her book and pulled out her worn leather purse to pay. But this time, instead of simply leaving her money and departing, she tore a small piece of paper from the back of her sketchbook and wrote something on it. She folded it carefully and placed it next to her payment, then looked directly at Marcus. "Good night, Marcus Rivera," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but clear as mountain water. Then she gathered her things and walked toward the door, leaving him staring after her in surprise. It was the first time he'd heard her speak, and her voice was exactly what he'd imagined, soft but sure, with a slight accent that spoke of Spanish lullabies and desert sunsets. He sat frozen for a moment, processing the gift she'd given him by speaking his name, before remembering the piece of paper she'd left behind. Martha appeared at Luna's empty table to clear the dishes, and Marcus watched as she unfolded the small note. The older woman's face softened as she read whatever was written there. Then she looked over at Marcus with something that might have been approval. "What does it say?" Marcus asked, surprising himself with his boldness. Martha smiled and handed him the note. In the same neat handwriting that had introduced Luna to him, she had written, "Thank you for sharing your table corner with me. Same time tomorrow?" Marcus stared at the note, reading it twice to make sure he understood correctly. She hadn't been intruding on his solitude. She'd been asking to share it. The distinction felt enormous, like the difference between trespassing and being invited in. "Well?" Martha asked, beginning to stack the empty bowls. "What's your answer?" Marcus looked at the note again, then at table 8 where Luna had sat with such quiet dignity. For 2 years he'd protected his grief like a treasure, hoarding it in the corner of Martha's diner where it could grow undisturbed. But Luna hadn't tried to take it from him, or fix it, or even acknowledge it directly. She'd simply offered to sit with it, to keep him company while he carried it. "Yes," he said quietly, folding the note carefully and tucking it into his shirt pocket, close to his heart where Sarah's ring rested against his chest. "Tell her yes." Martha's smile was warm enough to heat the entire diner. "I'll make sure she knows," she promised, then paused as she lifted the tray of dishes. "She's a good girl, Marcus, quiet but good. Sometimes the best conversations happen without words." As Marcus walked home through the cool desert night, he found himself looking forward to tomorrow evening for the first time in longer than he could remember. Not because his grief had lessened, it was still there, heavy and familiar as always, but because for 30 minutes each evening he wouldn't have to carry it alone. The stars seemed brighter tonight, scattered across the sky like Luna's careful pencil strokes across white paper. And somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate, a wild, lonely sound that somehow felt less lonely than usual. Marcus touched the note in his pocket and smiled. 3 weeks had passed since Luna Santos first sat at table 8, and Martha's diner had developed a new rhythm. Every evening at 6 o'clock, Marcus would arrive and take his seat at table 7. 5 minutes later, Luna would push through the brass-adorned door and settle gracefully into the chair across from him, her leather satchel containing the sketchbook that had become as much a part of the routine as Martha's beef stew. They had developed their own language of gestures and glances. Luna would raise her eyebrows and tilt her head toward the window when the sunset was particularly spectacular. Marcus would nod toward her sketchbook when he was curious about what she was drawing. She would smile when he remembered to save her the last piece of cornbread, and he would chuckle softly when she wrinkled her nose at the bitter coffee Martha served. Tonight felt different, though. Marcus had noticed it in the way Luna held herself when she walked in, something fragile in her usual composure, a tightness around her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. She'd ordered her usual stew but had barely touched it, instead focusing intently on her drawing with an almost desperate concentration. Martha had noticed too, The older woman made excuses to linger near their corner tables, refilling coffee cups that were still half full and adjusting the placement of the salt and pepper shakers with unusual fussiness. Marcus waited until Martha retreated to the kitchen before speaking. "Everything all right?" he asked quietly, the question feeling natural after weeks of shared silence. Luna looked up from her sketchbook, and Marcus saw that her sage-green eyes were bright with unshed tears. She started to nod. That automatic response of someone used to bearing burdens alone, then stopped. Instead, she flipped to a new page in her book and began to write. "My father found me," she wrote in her careful script, then turned the book toward Marcus. "He wants me to come home to Santa Fe. Says studying art is foolish, that I should marry the banker's son and settle down." Marcus read the words twice, feeling an unexpected surge of protectiveness rise in his chest. "Is that what you want?" he asked. Luna shook her head emphatically, then wrote again. "I want to study at the art school in San Francisco. I've saved enough money for the train ticket and first month's lodging. But he says it's improper for an unmarried woman to travel alone." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. Here was a young woman brave enough to sit in silence with a grieving stranger, who had traveled from Santa Fe to Copper Creek on her own, being told she wasn't capable of independence. He studied her face, seeing the determination warring with uncertainty in her expression. "What does your heart tell you?" he asked, borrowing a phrase Sarah used to use when he was wrestling with difficult decisions at the bank. Luna's pencil moved across the page, that some cages are made of gold, but they're still cages. That art isn't foolish, it's how I make sense of the world. That I'd rather fail trying to become who I'm meant to be than succeed at being who someone else wants me to be. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a recognition that went deeper than sympathy. For 2 years, he'd been living in his own cage, built from routine and grief and the safety of predictable solitude. Luna's words held up a mirror to his own life, showing him how he'd been choosing the familiar pain of loss over the uncertain possibility of healing. "When does the train leave?" he asked. "Day after tomorrow. But I can't." She stopped writing mid-sentence, then crossed out the words and started again. "I'm scared." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Marcus looked at this young woman who had shown him such quiet courage, who had sat with his grief without trying to fix it, who had offered companionship without demanding anything in return. She had given him the gift of her presence for 3 weeks, asking nothing but the simple courtesy of acknowledgement. Now she needed something from him, and he found himself wanting to give it. "Fear is natural," he said, thinking of Sarah and the countless nights he'd lain awake, terrified of facing another day without her. But fear of living is worse than fear of dying. Luna looked up at him sharply, and Marcus realized he'd spoken more honestly than he had in months. The words had come from some place deep inside him, a place that remembered what it felt like to take risks, to choose hope over certainty. She wrote quickly, "How do you know when to be brave?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering. Outside, the desert wind rattled the windows, and the oil lamps flickered like uncertain thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "My wife used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding that something else is more important than the fear." Luna's eyes widened slightly, and Marcus realized this was the first time he'd mentioned Sarah to anyone in Copper Creek, except Martha, and even then only in passing. The words felt strange on his tongue, but not painful. "Not anymore." "Tell me about her," Luna wrote. And to his surprise, Marcus did. He told her about Sarah's laugh, which had been too loud for proper ladies but perfect for summer evenings on their front porch. He told her about the way she'd hum while cooking, how she'd insist on dancing in the kitchen when her favorite songs played on the radio at the general store. He told her about the dress she'd worn on their wedding day, orange and purple like desert sunsets, and how she'd said she wanted to marry him when the world looked most beautiful. Luna listened with the same careful attention she gave her artwork. occasionally nodding or smiling at particularly sweet memories. When Marcus finished, she wrote, "She sounds like she would have liked your courage." "My courage?" Marcus laughed, but it wasn't bitter. "I've been hiding in this diner for 2 years. You spoke to me that first night when you could have ignored me. You've shared your quiet corner with a strange girl who doesn't speak. You've carried your grief with dignity instead of letting it make you cruel. That's courage, Marcus Rivera." Marcus stared at her words, seeing himself through her artist's eyes. Maybe she was right. Maybe simply surviving, simply showing up each day and maintaining his humanity in the face of devastating loss was its own form of bravery. Luna turned to a fresh page and began to sketch rapidly. Marcus watched her pencil move across the paper, creating lines that gradually resolved into a picture of the diner, their corner tables, the checkered tablecloths, the view of the desert through the window. But in the drawing, she had captured something more than just physical details. She had drawn the invisible threads of connection that had grown between Table 7 and Table 8, the warmth of shared silence, the comfort of understood solitude. When she finished, she carefully tore the page from her book and handed it to him. At the bottom she had written, "Thank you for teaching me that some of the most important conversations happen without words, and that it's possible to be alone together." Marcus studied the drawing, amazed at how she had captured not just the scene, but the feeling of these past 3 weeks. In the sketch, he looked less burdened somehow, and she looked less lost. They looked like two people who had found something valuable in each other's company. "Keep this," he said, trying to hand the drawing back to her. "Take it to San Francisco with you." Luna shook her head and gently pushed his hand back toward him. Then she wrote, "You keep it, to remember that grief shared is grief halved, and that there are many different ways to honor the people we've loved." The clock on the wall chimed 8 o'clock, later than either of them usually stayed. Luna began gathering her things, and Marcus felt the familiar pang of evening's end, but tonight it was accompanied by something else. Pride. Pride in this young woman's courage, and maybe, just maybe, a small spark of pride in his own. As Luna stood to leave, Marcus did something he hadn't done since that first night she'd sat down. He stood too. "Luna," he said, and she turned to face him. "The train to San Francisco. It stops in Flagstaff first, doesn't it?" She nodded, curious. "I have some business there," Marcus said, which wasn't entirely true, but wasn't entirely false either. He could always find business in Flagstaff if needed. "If you'd like some company for the first part of the journey." "Well, sometimes it's easier to be brave when you're not doing it alone." Luna's face transformed, that careful composure giving way to something radiant and unguarded. She didn't write anything this time. Instead, she simply walked around the table and, for just a moment, placed her small hand over his larger one. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice clear and strong. "For everything." As she walked toward the door, Marcus called after her. "Luna." She turned back. "Your father is wrong," Marcus said firmly. "Art isn't foolish, it's necessary. The world needs people who can show us how to see things differently." Her smile was answer enough. After she left, Marcus sat back down and studied the drawing she had given him. In it, he could see the man he had been, isolated, protective of his pain, afraid to let anyone too close. But he could also see the man he was becoming, someone who could carry grief without being crushed by it, who could honor his past while still choosing to have a future. Martha appeared at his elbow with the coffee pot. "She's leaving, isn't she?" the older woman asked gently. "Day after tomorrow," Marcus confirmed, "going to study art in San Francisco. And you?" Marcus looked at the drawing again, then at table 8 where Luna would sit one more time tomorrow night. "I'm going to take her as far as Flagstaff. Make sure she gets on the right train." Martha nodded approvingly. "Sarah would have liked that girl," she said quietly. Yes, Marcus agreed, touching the ring that hung beneath his shirt. She would have, and she would have liked knowing that Luna helped me remember something important. What's that? Marcus smiled, and for the first time in 2 years, it reached his eyes. That the best way to honor someone you've lost isn't to stop living. It's to live so fully that your life becomes a tribute to theirs. Outside, the desert wind carried the sound of a train whistle in the distance, the evening freight heading west toward California, toward possibilities, toward futures that required nothing more than the courage to climb aboard. Marcus carefully folded Luna's drawing and placed it in his shirt pocket, next to Sarah's ring and Luna's first note. Then he stood up, left his payment on the table, and walked out into the star-filled night, already planning what he would pack for the journey to Flagstaff. For the first time in 2 years, tomorrow felt like the beginning of something rather than just another day to get through, and in the morning he would buy 2 train tickets west.